God's graciousness, human sinfulness, and the call to a life of virtue. Okay, I have to combine certain topics, okay, and so that we may be able to cover. Anyway, they are very pretty much related with each other. Okay, but before we do that, do you have any questions as to the previous discussion that we had on freedom and responsibility? Are there? If there are none, then we proceed. Okay, I have to. Okay. Did you receive my? It was. I understand if you were not able to answer it, but I thought it may be meaningful. Had you opened it, had you had the opportunity to open it, the question that I actually posted in your Blackboard. Uh, it's a basic reflection on your own life's journey, okay? That we will see uh, and speak about human sinfulness and God's graciousness from the perspective of our own reality and experiences. I think that would be very important. Okay. So my proposed objectives for this session is to appreciate the working of God's graciousness in human life, and then secondly, to speak about the reality of sin from theological perspective. Normally, fundamental moral theological courses will have to touch on this fundamental dynamics in human experience. It's about the presence of grace on the one hand, and also the reality of human sinfulness on the other hand. Okay, and then also to clarify the demands of following Jesus that leads to a life of virtue. This is pretty much a lot of topic, but what we are going to do basically is just to highlight some significant points that may have to be considered in our discussions. Okay. The general framework is you speak about God's graciousness as a more pervading reality in our human life. But at the same time, just as we experience so much bounty of God's graciousness or graces in our lives, we also experience certain negativities about our human condition, especially starting with our own human frailties, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses. And we refer to this as human sinfulness. We are we have actually elements that is fundamentally also wounded. And then third is the fundamental call to a life of virtue. This is actually discipleship. Moral theology, especially in more contemporary times, is identifiable with discipleship, which means that when you talk about, for example, theology, systematic, Bible, liturgy, etc., when you speak about uh, what are the implications of this in our life as a moral agent, that fundamentally brings us to the whole theme of discipleship. And contemporary moral theology actually focuses on discipleship as something that is most fundamental in studying moral theology. And therefore, this is something that is profoundly connected with spirituality. Okay, if you remember when moral theology was pursued before the Second Vatican Council, it was very pallid and dry, precisely because it was so rational, and it was basically about casuistry and morals, or manuals. Okay, so there was really very little about the Bible. There was also very little about human experience per se, taking human experience very seriously, and at the same time, uh, it was somehow not understood within the matrix of spirituality, which is about human relationship with the divine, okay, or our relationship with Christ, whom we are called to follow. So for this session, we are going to speak about these three important dimensions, okay, uh, and deepen our insights and reflections about them. Okay, so I was actually I posted last night. It was late. I'm very sorry because uh, I have been attending to so many things. Okay, but what I wanted you to do basically is to ground yourself in your own story of life. Okay, here there is a little bit of spirituality. Uh, much more on spirituality during this session, because when you speak about experience of God's graciousness and my own sinfulness and infidelity, that basically boils down to a question of fundamental relationships, no, with the divine. I was I wanted to ask you, okay, to draw a line, okay, starting from your birth, uh, putting the number of the year when you were born up to the present 2020, and then in between that point of beginning up to now, I wanted you to reflect what were, or in how did you experience God's graciousness in your life. Okay, you may identify three to five uh, important moments when you felt God was so real and was evidently intervening in your life, you know, bringing about graces. Okay, you experience God's graciousness. So if the grace is overwhelmingly, uh, tremendously uh, uh, great, then you put a long arrow up. Okay, but when the grace is more normal, just put a normal line, an arrow going upward. Okay, then uh, you will also have to more or less identify where did you experience human weaknesses, times when you turned your back uh, from basic and fundamental commitments that you have, especially in terms of your significant relationships. Okay, and then you put an arrow down. If it's tremendously big infidelity, you move down, more longer arrow down. Okay, so I don't know if you can do that for the next 2 to 3 minutes. Just identify that, okay, so that you may see yourself at least in touch with your own reality and with your own experience. Can you do that? Do you have a pen with you? Somebody's knocking. I'll just have to answer. Sandali. Yes. Come in. We were talking about uh, the framework, okay? God's graciousness as a fundamental matrix within which we are born, we exist in the world. And then, but there is also a dimension of our human sinfulness. The basic question of James was, how does that happen? God, the one who created us, how come there is this fundamental reality of our negativities and weaknesses? We'll explain that in this session. Okay, and then eventually we are being called precisely to pursue a life of virtue as a way of following Jesus, because God will not abandon us in our own perdition, in our loss. There will always be an invitation. Come on, respond to this. In freedom, come to me. Okay? He does not say like a parent, oh, bahala ka na, you died to you. I don't care about you anymore. No, that's not how God deals with humanity. Okay? So first, we have to be able to take a look at some theological concepts about grace. Okay? And we will try to expound on several points. God's graciousness in human life, okay, we will see this as a general experience in faith. That's the first point. Second point that we will try to elaborate here is God's graciousness is manifested in creation, especially of human life. God's graciousness becomes so evident in many different dimensions of our own experience, starting with creation and all the others that come along with God's own creative power in our lives. Third, okay, we will try to answer and grapple with the issue of the theological reflections on God's graciousness. When God, in a way, gives us grace, does He violate our freedom? We will expound on that. And then, fourth, some controversial issues related to the relationship of grace and human freedom. That's the point. Okay. Theological, we will see that. Okay. Let's start with the first one. God's graciousness is an experience in faith. Okay? We know that we can look at our human experience in a very secular and natural way, isn't it? For example, you happen to get sick, and then you can explain, because you did not eat, you did not sleep well, etc., etc. There will always be a scientific way of explaining reality, okay? As as a product of the natural processes that we experience in our lives, isn't it? And scientists like sociologists, anthropologists, okay, psychologists, and many other sciences have been, in a way, put up, okay, or have been organized precisely to be able to give an explanation of what is really going on in our life, in our psyche, in certain human processes of socialization and history, etc. All of those could be explained through natural means, natural events, or natural processes, or to the natural law, isn't it? That's one fundamental perspective. Okay, that is the perspective of reason. But there is also a reality we speak about that goes beyond the natural interpretation of events in our lives. When we begin to look at human experiences and reality from the perspective not only of science, but from the perspective of faith, that human history does not remain mainly a natural or human history, but it gets transformed into an experience of God's intervening in our lives, leading us, inviting us to an experience of salvation. And so we call that salvation history. That comes from the perspective of faith. For example, when we had the experience of EDSA revolution, and there are a lot of reflections on that. Astorga is one moral theologian now based in the US who has actually written a book precisely using her fundamental intuitions coming from the EDSA experience of the Filipinos as an important framework to cast her own social ethics. Okay, and here uh, we see, for example, in EDSA, some people would explain EDSA, anthropologists, sociologists, social psychologists will explain it as, a building of resistance, no, to the Marcos regime, to the Marcos dictatorial regime. It must have started, from some people who have been disgruntled by the system and have decided to put up organizations that will put up resistance. Some of this became very militant and even to some extent violent, like the group of Joma Sison. Okay, uh, and he had, for example, the underground movement. Okay, CPP-NPA. Okay, and at the same time, some people now, the whole issue now about red tagging, um, make uh, they make connections between the legal fronts of the NDF, okay, among the teachers, among students, League of Filipino students, etc., and many different groups, as profoundly connected with the underground movement. Okay, that is the legal front, they say. Okay, and they say one historical explanation of that, at least Randy David himself would point to that, is that it was a building of resistance that eventually made people conscious through consciousness raising that in fact Marcos was a very, very bad leader, a dictator, a human rights violator, etc., and all those. So, and then you see a moment in human history in the Philippines, EDSA is a natural conclusion of that process of resistance that turned out to be nonviolent. You can explain it that way, fine, and that makes a lot of sense. But you can also look at such experience from a different light. When we were reflecting on this after the EDS revolution in the Simbahang Lingkod ng Bayan, people began to look at the experience and said, there's so much intervention of faith in the process of that event. Okay, people were holding rosaries, we're bringing in the images of Our Lady, of Jesus Christ, the Holy Cross, etc., etc. And then some people began to look at this experience not anymore as a mere natural human history, but this is God's own salvific action in our lives as a Filipino. Okay, do you understand? And so EDSA is likened to an exodus experience. Some people were referring to this as the Filipino exodus from a state of slavery, oppression, to one that gives way to liberation and freedom. So that changes altogether the perspective. When things are viewed from the perspective of faith, you see very much the hand of God in that reality. Okay? And that is the same with many experiences that we have. Okay? You could see, this has happened to me, but some people, the doctors will explain, you got sick because of this and that and that. And then some people would associate that, I got sick. This is my way of appreciating God's invitation because I've forgotten Him, etc. Now He's asking me, to go back to Him, reminding me of the more important things in life. COVID-19, for example, pandemic, we can actually explain this naturally, okay, as part of a human history, but you can always explain this also from the perspective of faith and say, okay, God has probably allowed this for different reasons. For us to be able to rediscover, okay, the real most important things in life and relativize what we've always held as absolutes in our life. Is that clear? Okay, that's the first point. Second point, God's graciousness is actually first and foremost experienced in His creation, in His work of creation. Okay? The fundamental biblical stories that we see in Genesis actually was trying to fundamentally ask the question, what is the source of all the good things in the world? Why do we have air to breathe, water to drink? Why do we have trees that bear fruit for us, for our nurturance, etc.? And then fundamentally, the originary intuition, especially of those who wrote the Bible, that took on, okay, the oral tradition first among the people, Okay, you know that it was constituted by four traditions. Okay, the Yahwist, the priestly, the Deuteronomist. Okay, what else? What is the other one? Okay, they are actually expressions trying to fundamentally answer the question, what is the source of all things in life? And then the response to this fundamental intuition or question is that God is the source of all the good things in the world. Okay? And the whole story of creation, okay? One is the priestly account, and the other one is the Yahwist account. Actually, uh, have different ways of making such account of creation story. Okay? But both point to the reality that God is the source of life, of all the things. The priestly account would talk about let there be light, let there be, etc., let there be, like in a priestly order of liturgy, and etc. But the Yahwist would give an image of God, a very anthropomorphic image of God, depicting God as if he's a human being and he associates with us. Like, when God created Adam and Eve, he had to come up with the clay and fashion it and eventually breathe into it. He was like, having anthropomorphic image in the creation of humanity. Okay? Kaya nga, for example, when he made Adam and Adam, okay, he fashioned him. When Adam, he was complaining, I'm alone, I'm not happy, fully happy, and God made him. God lulled him to sleep, and then when he was sleeping, he actually took, the one of his ribs and created Eve. And when he woke up, he was fascinated by the beauty of Eve and eventually found, a source of fulfillment for his own being as a man, okay, to be uh, complemented or pwede natin sabihin mutual uh, you know of mutual experience of fulfillment as human persons. He woke up, sabi niya, the sun belongs to the sky, the leaves belong to the tree, the grapes belong to the vine, but you belong to me. Okay, isn't it a miracle? Wow, it's like a song, So that's a high experience of Adam and Eve. Okay, now uh, another important point here is the theological reflections on God's graciousness. In theology, you would see that our life, especially as a result of our being creatures, is permeated with our experience of natural grace. Everything that we have, everything that we are, form part of the natural blessings that God has made available to us. And then theology would also speak about preternatural grace. When he made Adam and Eve, they enjoyed preternatural grace. That is a grace that is already experienced here and now, but in an anticipation of the fullness of life that would come. Preternatural grace means you will not have to get sick, you will not even die, etc. Okay, there will only be a crossing over from this to another life. So those are theological reflections in trying to understand the grace that God has made available for humanity because of his love for us. And then you talk about the supernatural grace. That is the grace, okay, uh, speaking about God's own indwelling in humanity, okay, and entering into our life, okay, as somebody uh, who would enable us to be the best persons that we could be, okay. So these are made available for all of us, for Adam and Eve right from the very beginning. Of course, different groups would speak about, like Jansenists would not talk about supernatural grace, but only natural grace was available. and the sufficient grace was enough for humanity to be able to pursue his fundamental goodness. Okay, and that's precisely because of that they limit the possibility for uh, people's capacity to be redeemed and to be saved. Controversial issues related to our appreciation of grace, human nature. Okay, uh, we said that part of our humanity and is our own fundamental experience of freedom. Okay, but according to Thomas Aquinas, when we speak of God's grace does not somehow impede our exercise of freedom, but it only precisely enhances human freedom. If we understand biblical freedom the right way, then we will see that divine grace is there to be able precisely to enable us to pursue what God has designed for us, okay? Our full potentials as human persons, okay? In fact, according to Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, no, uh, Aristotle speaks about the importance of having to pursue our excellences according to our natural capacities. Okay, but Thomas Aquinas, corrective of Aristotle, in his attempt not to be able to appropriate the framework of Aristotle, but making use the Pauline perspective of Augustine. Okay, he would say that human nature may not have the capacity precisely to pursue the fullness of his potential precisely because of his wounded nature. Okay, against the very, very optimistic understanding of Aristotle about human nature, because of which he actually can think the possibility of humans to be able to pursue his excellences as defined by the community. According to Thomas Aquinas, that only becomes possible, especially when grace is made available to humanity that has been wounded. Okay? So, divine grace for Thomas Aquinas is actually there present to be able to precisely enable humanity to become free to pursue what God wants him to be. Of course, modern philosophers, okay, rationalists of the 18th century and 19th century, were talking about, doing away with God's own providence and intervention in human life. That's why they started talking about natural theology or deism, and they say, okay, we can allow the concept of religion, okay, especially in terms of a sense of greatness, of transcendence. Okay, we can allow that because that may actually give a sense of purpose for humanity to transcend himself. But they would not want to understand God as somebody who constantly intervenes in human affairs, because if that were so, that would violate human freedom according to in the liberal tradition. Okay, and that is the reason they want to do away with God. Nietzsche, for example, would say, for example, the Gay Science, the book he published, he was talking about the death of God. God has to die precisely to be able to give birth to the human potentials, to be able to pursue himself in freedom. Okay, and those actually would reflect on Nietzsche's initial intuition on this, would always even say that we have to kill the God we believe in, so that we don't hold on to him, but in a way depend mostly on ourselves, on our autonomous capacity to pursue whatever we need to pursue in terms of our full potential, even beyond the metaphysics that have been dictated upon us by religion. So they do away with metaphysics. And postmodern thinking, for example, is one way of illustrating that. Do you understand? Okay? So they negate they negate, in the exercise of human freedom, they negate divine grace, divine providence, divine intervention, because that may be violative of human freedom. From Christian perspective, we do not agree with that. Following Thomas Aquinas, we say no. When God comes in, intervenes, and actually makes greater possibilities for human, because of his grace, to pursue his best potentials as human person. God is not violating human freedom, but only enhancing human freedom. It's just a machine. When a machine, for example, gets distorted, grace would come in the form of an oil that would, that would make the engine become more working better, okay, so that it may reach its purpose for which it is made. Is that clear? Of course, this whole debate has happened in human history. Okay. Another point is some fundamental concepts about sin. Okay. And now we move on to sin. Okay, I don't have enough time. I will just have to continue with this. Maybe I will just finish on this dimension, and then after that, I'll leave. I'll finish it in 10 minutes or so, and then after that, we'll have questions. I will talk about discipleship later on. Okay. Some fundamental concepts about sin. First, I would like to stress that whenever we speak about sin, especially in the way we understand it today in contemporary moral theology, sin actually, the basic, we have to be able to establish that there is a universal reality of human sinfulness and vulnerability that we experience in our life. It's almost something that almost everyone agrees, no? That we are not sometimes, okay, doing the right things that we want to do, just like what St. Paul would say, how come I do the things that I don't want to do, and I don't do the things that I want to do, etc. That is a fundamental reality. And then, second point that I would like to discuss with you briefly is the origin of human sinfulness and weakness. And that speaks about not only about actual sin in the world, but about original sin and its consequences, especially in theological reflections. And then third, what is the nature of sin biblically, especially in terms of our new moral theology? Later, before, sin was associated with violation of God's law. But now we understand sin not as a violation of God's law, but as an experience of infidelity to the demands of a loving relationship with God. Let's start with the first point. That then you talk about the social dimension of sin is something that was also put forward, especially after Vatican II. The first point, okay. The universal reality of human sinfulness. I think no one would ever say, even the psalmist would say, even a holy man would actually, uh, uh, you know, commit would have some imperfections in his or her life. If you claim that you're perfect, you're actually a liar. Okay, the sin that we see in the world permeates in many different corners of our existential reality. Okay, okay, brokenness in relationship, in the family, in oneself, okay, especially in terms of addictions, corruption in high places, etc., are all there present, okay, in our world. And I think this is something that is heightened, especially in our own reality today. As I was explaining at the very beginning of my course, I was saying that you can never speak about humanity as one group are so perfect and another group is so imperfect or a sinner. You cannot talk anymore in terms of uh, the tragic plays, or you talk about the epics when you would have associate excellences only with a hero, and then you all in a way associate all negativities and all bad things with the villain. No, we in humanity itself, you have the presence precisely of our own capacity, potential to be best, to be good, but we also have potential to be evil and to be bad. Okay, that's one fundamental reality that we experience. In fact, some people are saying what was defined in the Council of Trent, okay, when it talks about original sin, was not about the fact that we inherited something, and there is some kind of sin here that needs to be washed away by baptism, etc. But it speaks about precisely because of the universal reality of human sinfulness, original sin was defined in trend in relation to the fundamental recognition of the universal need of salvation in Christ because every human being is wounded and is a sinner. And therefore, everyone would need salvation in Christ. And that was apparently what was defined. But of course, in our tradition, okay, when we speak, for example, uh, of original sin, okay, as part of our reflection, okay, uh, it basically points to our experience of the negativities in life. If early on, the questions of in tradition, in oral tradition, was what is the source of everything that is good in our life? And then they came up with stories or myths in the Bible, okay, talking about God is the source. By the way, when I say myths, I'm not saying that that is wrong, okay? That is not true, okay? When what we have in the Bible are myths, actually. Okay, the stories of in Genesis are myths. Okay, they are not historically factual, but it does not mean that they are not true in terms of the theological import that they want to convey as a symbolic language. Okay, contemporary epistemology would speak about truth only in terms of evidentiality. Okay, truth can be claimed scientifically when you can find concrete historical and objective evidence that you can actually prove that is present there. Okay, but that's not how we define truth in Christian theology. Truths that we claim are metaphysical and they go beyond the physical evidence. And that therefore, sometimes truth in their intricacy and their complexity sometimes can only be conveyed through symbolic language like myths and stories. And that is exactly how we want to appreciate the myths in the Bible. There are stories which convey the truths, okay, that are drawn from our beliefs and we presume to be truths that have been revealed to humanity, okay, and now communicated through symbolic language like myths, like stories, etc. So in such stories, when they ask the question, why do we experience negativities in life? And then the answer they provide for this question is drawn from their own historical reality and experience. Isn't it that God is the source of all things, and that therefore, if God is the source of all things, then everything that we would experience would have been very positive and very nice and very beautiful and very good. But how come we experience death, we experience famine, we experience calamities, we experience all these sorts of things that make us suffer and put our life in pain and struggles? So that is the question, the existential question from which, okay, the Jewish people were trying to answer, uh, uh, wanted to give an answer to. And drawn from their experience, we have to realize, okay, that the most profound problems that humanity or that the Jewish people experience in their historical sojourn, particularly after they were liberated by God, okay, from their slavery in Egypt. That was a kind of an intervention of God saving them, okay, bringing them beautiful intervention of God's creative power and liberative power in their lives. But when they were in the desert, they experienced all forms of negativities. But it looks like that in their experience, the moment they turned their back on the covenant with Yahweh, which they actually sealed in Mount Sinai, just before they actually took on the long 40 years in the desert, okay? Whenever they experienced that they were not faithful to Yahweh, those were the moments that they experienced negativities. Do you understand? But whenever they would go back to Yahweh and become faithful to the covenant, those were the moments when they experienced life, health, bounty, salvation in their lives. Okay? Now, drawing on from that experience, when did they become unfaithful to the covenant? When they allowed themselves to be seduced by Canaanite fertility cults. Okay? When they turned their back on Yahweh. That's why the question is, what was really being depicted in the story of the fall of man, where you see a serpent coming out and in a way seducing Eve, and then eventually Adam was also seduced to fall into sin in a way. What was the sin? Was it a sin of disobedience? Was it a sin of pride? You know, more and more biblical scholars would refer to this as the sin of idolatry. Why? Because from the experience, they actually embodied this whole experience that they had historically, okay, and put them into the myth of the fall of man, okay. And that in that story, what do you see? There is a serpent, okay, that seduced Eve, okay. The serpent was apparently like the villain. Where do they draw the serpent? The serpent actually was a prominent figure in fertility cults in Canaanite religions. Okay? When you speak of fertility cults, the serpent comes as a prominent symbol because the serpent is a symbol of productivity. It's a phallic symbol. And if you associate, what is a phallus? It's a male organ, okay? And the phallic symbol is a sign of productivity and generativity. So they adore the serpents, which is actually a symbol of the phallus, okay, that were adored in fertility Canaanite gods so that they may be able to allow the land to be productive, that there may be plenty in agriculture and also water, etc. Okay, and because of which some of the Jews were seduced to adore fertility cults or the serpents as well in the Canaanite religions. Okay, it is like typifying that in the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. Okay, and so they explain the answer that they give to this question: why do we experience negativities in life? Because we turn our back, okay, on Yahweh, on the covenantal relationship with Yahweh. Okay, things happen negatively in our lives when we do not become faithful to Yahweh. And that is how they explained original sin. Original sin points to the fundamental breakup in the relationship with Yahweh. Humanity being represented in the myth of Adam and Eve were actually typologies of what humanity is. And when humanity turned its back on Yahweh, especially in that fundamental relationship, then we see that we experience all forms of negativities in life. Science, modern science would talk about that in terms of, when you actually plunder creation, when you, for example, are not respectful to the environmental integrity and cosmic cycle and cosmic relationship in our environment, then Mother Earth will actually get back on you in terms of all these forms of calamities. So such kind of thinking was was building up in the consciousness of the Jews when they actually uh, retold the story of the fall as a way to communicate a particular truth claim that they actually held on and now considered in our tradition as part of the revealed truths coming from God. Okay, having said that, how do we now understand sin? Sin is not just about, not following the command of God. So moving away from a very legalistic framework, which we prevailed in Judaism, which also prevailed during the time of the monastic tradition, which was also prevailed during the time of moralists, uh, uh, casuistry, and manualist tradition. We say that it is not about the law only, but it is about relationship. It is about infidelity to our relationship with God that we can speak of sin. Okay, that is the nature of sin, at least in contemporary moral theology. And this is precisely portrayed in the story of the fall. Okay, when we speak of the self, in a way, experiencing break up in a relationship with oneself, that is the experience of Adam and Eve. Okay, when they actually uh, turned their back on Yahweh, what happened? They experienced a kind of disintegration within themselves. They began to look at themselves maliciously. Okay, when they were naked, began to be aware, oh, I'm naked, we have to hide ourselves. Because they began to put malice in the natural constitution of our body. Yeah? So, minsan, yung hubad na katawan becomes a source of temptation precisely because there is a disintegration that happened. Okay? So, but ordinarily, I mean, it could not be necessarily a source of temptation. And that eventually that became part of the moral tradition, especially in the Puritanic tradition. We will discuss that later on when we study sexual morality. So there is a fundamental chasm that was created within humanity, and that Saint Paul would say, precisely as I was saying earlier, okay, how come I do not do the things that I want to do, and I do the things I, 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 I cannot do the things that I want to do. There is a fundamental conflict within us. And there was also a fundamental conflict between humanity, oneself, and others. Adam, when Eve was created, he looked at her and said, oh, the sun belongs to the sky, you belong to me. You are the flesh of my flesh, the bone of my bones. Okay? They are one. And now it was beginning to point to Eve as the source of the problem. Because that woman you put with me in the garden actually tempted me. So that becomes a problem. You begin to pinpoint others as a source of your own weakness. So there is a breakup of relationship even between Adam and Eve, and then with nature as well. The Genesis story of the fall, we consequently lead to a problem with humanity and its cooperation of nature with humanity. Before, humanity, of course, had to work, but work was so easy, was so nice because of the cooperation of nature. But now you have to labor hard, or even your own giving birth would be very difficult. Okay, I remember a good friend of mine would say, yeah, a gynecologist would say, Father, I sometimes, I just find it so ridiculous that some of the women, when they give birth, they would sometimes curse their husband for the pain that they experience during the birthing. Okay, but then the following year they would see that same person lying again, giving birth again to another child. So, but that is happening precisely because in Genesis you see that Eve actually had to suffer even in birthing of a newborn, etc. And of course, all of this happened because man decided to turn his back on God. So when we speak of sin as an infidelity to relationship, it talks about breaking relationships with others, with oneself, with God, and with nature. Consequences of sin, theological reflection, loss of natural grace. Had we not sinned, had Adam and Eve not sinned, uh, they say we would not have lost our natural grace. The natural grace to understand clearly things, the natural grace to remember, many beautiful things, and we don't become forgetful. But now, when you study, you have to labor so hard. When you listen to class, you feel like you understand everything, but the moment you leave the class, only 10% remains. So that's part of the difficulty that we experience now, as the imperfection that we have now in terms of natural constitution. We get sick and then we die. We also lost our preternatural grace. We suffer, we get sick, we experience death in our lives. And then also loss of supernatural grace. We were supposed to be temple of God's, spirit in us, but because of our sinfulness, okay, we have lost the presence of God in our lives. And these have to be restored through baptism or through confession. Baptism, in a way, uh, provides correction to original sin, and sacrament of reconciliation provides corrective to our actual sins. And then, of course, because of human sinfulness and breakup of relationship, everything that started with mere personal sinfulness in the level of personal relationship gets transformed into structures of sin that we see prevalent in our society today. Okay, those form part that our sin cannot but have social dimension. You cannot say, no, I'm only doing this sin in my private room, in the privacy of my life. Okay, but every sin, okay, has always a social dimension. It affects people around you, either directly or indirectly. And that therefore attempts not to be able to precisely bring about dimension, salvific dimension in our own sinful reality and sinful structure will be about bringing back broken relationships that starts with our fundamental reconciliation with God, that in a way enables us to experience peace. And the peace that we experience within us gets translated in the peace we experience in our relationship with the world. Just like what the song would say, if there's one more gift, di ba? Sabi, I ask of you, it would be peace. The confusions that is around us is but mere reflections of what's within. So if you want to correct the problem that we find in this structure, we have to be able to resolve also the fundamental chasm that we experience within us as human persons. Okay? I would like to